Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're going to get this kicked off. So the first order of business is if you could join me in standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Good evening. Appreciate you taking the time tonight. My name is Todd Eachus. I am the president of Families of Ocean City United in Success. And before we kick off, I want to say a couple words about that. Focus is an organization that was started a little over a year ago by a group of people who recognize to their very core just how special our town is. I know I came here some 61 years ago, the very first time I was 8 days old. My mom brought me down to the family house. The family's been on the island since 1939. But we have a very special town here. We have a unique heritage, a unique culture. And Focus was formed about not only maintaining that and observing that and respecting that, but looking forward to the future and engaging during a very interesting time in our nation's history from a political perspective in transparency, open debate, the distribution of fact. We're not all going to agree on everything, but the disinfectant of sunlight and transparency is helpful in helping us respectfully come to conclusions. I take it, and this may be a little bit quote, but I take it as an article of faith that those who are motivated to enter public service do so out of their love for our country, our state, our town, etc. And so injecting into that the most transparency that we can is important. And look, Focus will help candidates who share those core values get elected. But that can only be done through your help. If you're interested in what is going on, your involvement, your voice, and your engagement with the organization is critically important, because I will tell you that in the era of social media, debate sometimes gets a little bit distorted, and that concerns, I think, all of us. And campaigns are long and arduous and stressful. I can tell you, more than 20 years ago, I ran for school board, and I remember clearly this day when I had the epiphany that I had lost perspective when my mom called me, and she said, "You know, I'm so proud of you for doing this. I'm so proud of you that I actually donated $25 to your campaign today." And my first response was, "Thanks, Mom, but gee, if you can do 25, I'm sure you can do 50. And then I had to take a step back and regain perspective. But Focus is going to continue to do the work here, but also to bring events like this. Tonight is very important. I hope the information that you glean is useful to you and helps to engage you. By the way, you will see two codes that you can borrow. On the left is one that you can send an email to the governor, and you can do that in real time, right from your seat here if you choose to. And the other is to scan and post a public comment today. So before we get started, I just want to say there are a lot of public officials from City Council, from the county, and from the State Assembly. And I want to thank them all for being here. The biggest risk in being an opening speaker is trying to list all of the public officials in the audience and with the fear of missing someone. So out of due respect, I just want to thank all of you for your public service and for coming tonight. And with that, it is my privilege to introduce a friend, a dedicated public service, and someone who I know loves our city as much as all of you do and I do, and that is our Mayor, Jay Gillian.
Well, good evening. Events like this are important because they're going to give information out. So I hope everybody gets involved. I mean, when the DEP and organizations like our government bypass everybody and write executive orders, it's very dangerous. So we had that with the windmills, and now we're having with this. So, but I really just want to thank our county commissioners, Director Desiderio and his whole team, Senator Testa and Antoine, our assembly. You know, they work hard, and nobody even asked them what they thought about this. So again, this is very important here for Ocean City, so I'm thankful for everybody. Mr. Lomax and his group, they've been able to bring this so we can all understand. So I just want to welcome everybody, and these are some serious things that are happening in the state of New Jersey, and it just doesn't affect Ocean City on the islands, it affects all of us. So again, thank you for coming tonight. See, I should have had something written down. Director Desiderio, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Gillian. That's why you are the second best mayor in the county of May County. Thank you for being here tonight. It is great to see you, and thank you for taking the time. This is, as the mayor said, a very, very important issue that affects all of us. This is going to affect not only those of us in Ocean City, but throughout the county and throughout the state of New Jersey. This has all come about, and you're going to hear more about it, but this has all come about through a executive order from our governor, executive order number 100, without going through the legislature. As you know, we elect legislators to represent us here in May County, and we have an excellent group that represents us with Senator Testa, Assemblyman McClellan, and Assemblyman Simonson. This was done without any discussion with any of the 120 legislators that represent us in Trenton. This was done by a pen by the governor. So the County Board of Commissioners, including myself as director, Vice Director Andy Bolakowski, who is here, Commissioner Will Morey, Melanie Collette, who is also with us today, and Ocean City's own Bobby Barr, who is also here, have been at the forefront on this issue since leading the charge both in the county and throughout the state of New Jersey. The proposed 1,100 pages of rules are the most far-reaching and impactful since the establishment of CAFRA in the mid-1980s, and will have the greatest impact on the county of Cape May and its 16 municipalities, more so than any other county in the state of New Jersey. These rule proposals are not limited to only coastal communities, but also impact our mainland communities, affordable housing stock, and persons with disabilities at an inordinate level. To this point, the county has enlisted an expert on the subject matter, Peter Lomax of Lomax Consulting, and we have made his services available to all 16 municipalities specific to this issue. The county wishes to thank the city of Ocean City for hosting this forum and asks everyone to consider being an active participant and make your voice heard by utilizing the county's QR code to send an email to the governor and post a public comment on the state of New Jersey's website. This is very, very important, and as you hear from Mr. Lomax, you're going to hear how important it is, and also you're going to be hearing from our Assemblyman McClellan. With that said, I would like to introduce someone that works very, very hard for us, not only here in Ocean City, but throughout the district and the state, our Assemblyman, Antoine McClellan. Thank you.
Good evening, Ocean City. So, since 2019, we've done a couple things in the legislature, myself, Senator Testa, and Assemblyman Simonson, and we fought against a lot of legislation. This is not legislation, this is an executive order. Senator Testa in Cumberland County, myself and Eric in Cape May County, and also Atlantic County as well. This is the greatest thing that we're going to be facing. We fought against the wind turbines, and that even came to the legislature to vote upon. We fought against it, we railed against it, led by Senator Testa in the county, but we had opportunity to speak. We didn't have an opportunity to speak on this. So this is an opportunity for us to speak now and fight against the change of life that they're trying to impose upon us. So the county, myself, and a couple other officials have gone up to Ocean County when they first opened the public comment period. And we had to listen to a lot of testimony. Specifically testimony that was saying nobody should be living on barrier islands. Barrier islands are for animals. The people should be off and inland and allow the animals to take over the islands and run free. That's a problem, considering the billions of dollars that Cape May County sends up to Trenton each and every year and to get pennies back. We've enlisted other legislative districts in Monmouth County, in Ocean County, Atlantic County, and soon to be Salem County to join in this fight. So we're asking you guys to join in that fight with us. So no message is too small, and no message will not go unheard, specifically by this state and the DEP. The commissioner has decided that this is the time for them to enlist this coastal climate change. Everybody knows climate change is real, but it's real to everybody that lives here consistently. And so ask us how we should be doing our municipalities, how we should be constructing our buildings, how should we be building our houses, how people need to get into their houses. So we raise the houses another 5 feet. I know I had to raise my house in Sandy. If I have to raise my house another 5 feet, I don't know how I'm getting into that. My mother's 80 years old. How is she going to be expected to climb those stairs on a consistent basis? And we have a lot of seniors in Cape May County, and also some in Cumberland County. And so realize this is not just affecting Cape May County, this is affecting the entire state. And you'll see by Mr. Lomax, the entire county as a whole is going to be in a flood zone. So what does that mean? Everybody that doesn't have flood insurance is going to be required to get flood insurance. They're going to plan to deed restrict your house to say that you live in a flood zone. So if you choose to do 51% of repairs to your house, you're going to have to raise it an additional 5 feet. And Mr. Lomax is going to give you all the information that you're going to need to know and take back and make that decision. We're not telling you need to agree with us, but we want to make sure that you have the information. So the League of Municipalities is against this. The associations of counties is against this. Chambers of Commerce are against this. We need you to be against this with us. And we're just asking them to give us an opportunity to speak about it and build the places in our municipalities that we want to build. Design it the way we want to design it. Not have a stairway to heaven that's going to lead up where you're going to have to go 150,000 stairs to get into your house. And they don't realize that anybody that's going to require an elevator is below base flood elevation. So how are you going to put that elevator in? We've had many calls to our office where we had to fight against the state for somebody to put an elevator in now or a platform in now without this restriction. So what is this restriction going to cause? More problems, but more money for the state, more money for attorneys. No offense to any attorneys in the room, Senator Testa, but we don't need the opportunity to give more money to attorneys. It's just a pain in the butt. CAFRA permits. Does anybody know what a CAFRA permit is? Anybody? How much of a pain is it to fight for a CAFRA permit now? Imagine what's going to have to happen when you're in Upper Township having to fight for a CAFRA permit for a place that's not going to get any water anytime soon. If I get water in my house now, this city is done. It's done. So we don't need to prepare for a 75-year storm right now. Let us build towards that. Let us do things that we can do to protect our city and protect our way of life. We don't need bureaucrats from places that don't know about Ocean City. I'm not in Trenton telling somebody in Mercer County how they should live. I'm telling them how we live here in Cape May County. And that's the respect that all 120 elected officials in this state want. You vote us in for a reason. We're going to be your voice. We'll continue to be your voice. But we want you to be our voice now, because they didn't give us a voice. They didn't give us opportunity to speak on the floor. They didn't give us opportunity to say anything. So this is the opportunity now. They've actually increased the response time till November 7th as opposed to November 3rd. And that's because we requested that. But that's a whole 4 days. In 2025, this is planned to be enacted. So the time is now to make sure our voices are heard. Make sure the governor knows that we don't want this. We want to have opportunity to have a seat at the table and discuss what our area should look like, what our county should look like, what our places should look like. They want us to raise the houses but not raise the roads. So how's that supposed to work? So you're going to drive underwater to get to higher ground? This is the nonsense that we're dealing with from bureaucrats that don't understand. If they want to protect our coast, let's protect our coast together. Let's do the beach replenishment together. It's all about doing things together, not having dictatorships by an executive order that is unnecessary. We're stronger together. So right now, my request is that we do this together. We fight together. We're one voice together. We're one county together. We're one city together. God, family, country, together. I'm going to introduce Peter Lomax, who's a lot smarter than me. They can explain what all this means, but just realize together we are stronger. We don't let anybody come in and tell us how we should live. You elect officials in your town, and we work together to decide how we should live and protect our way of life. So God bless you. Enjoy this night. I'll be sitting over there to answer any questions on the legislative level, but all the important questions go to Peter Lomax. He'll be here talking after me. So Mr. Peter Lomax.
Good evening. I'm smart enough to understand a mic drop moment when I hear it. I'm not sure there's a whole lot left to say. As Assemblyman McClellan mentioned to you, my name is Peter Lomax. I'm here from the Lomax Consulting Group. And as Director Desiderio mentioned, the county has really been at the forefront of understanding these proposed regulations, and they asked me very early on in the process, even before the very first proposal, to take a look at the over 1,000 pages of regulations. And I wasn't sure whether to say thank you or goodbye quickly, because 1,000 pages of regulations is exactly what it sounds like. So a little bit of background about myself. I'm a graduate of Rutgers University in environmental planning. I'm not a climate scientist. I'm not here to debate the merits of climate science and climate change. But for the last 30 years, I have been navigating the complex land use regulatory environment in New Jersey. We have 5 levels of government, from the federal government all the way to the municipal level. Each has a stake in the land use process. And as you might imagine, 5 levels of land use regulation tends to get complicated quickly, even without 1,000 pages of new regulation. Just pause for a moment here. I knew I was missing something. So again, this comes directly through the executive branch of government. Executive Order 100, as you heard, established the Protecting Against Climate Threats policy of the state government. That then mandated that DEP begin developing regulations that would create resilient environments and landscapes. That's an acronym that you'll see reflected in the regulations. And these rules were published on August 5th. That established a 90-day public comment period. These rules were intended to use the best available predictive climate science to address sea level rise, extreme weather intensification, and chronic flooding. They were intended to update existing regulations, some of which you might be familiar with. The Coastal Zone Management Rules, which includes CAFRA, Waterfront Development and Coastal Wetlands Protection. The Freshwater Wetlands Protection Rules. The Flood Hazard Control Act rules, the Stormwater Management rules. You start to get the idea. We have a lot of regulation, and this adds to those. So right now we're in the midst of a 90-day public comment period. As you heard, this was originally supposed to end on November 3rd, and by the grace of the state government, we've been given an additional 4 days for public comment. That's not much time, even though an extension was requested well beyond that. I think the important takeaway here, and when I finish, I'll make sure that the QR codes are back up again. The window is closing. You have a limited time to act and to provide comment. And however you feel about these regulations and however you feel about climate change, we have a duty to respond to these rules. We have a duty to ring in, to make our feelings heard. And if you feel impacted by these rules, you will be mistaken if you don't take this opportunity to submit comments. As Assemblyman McClellan mentioned, there were 3 public hearings that were initially held, 1 in person, 2 virtually, and then the rest of and they all occurred in September, so there's been no opportunity in October or, really in October to participate in any kind of an in-person session with DEP and to ask questions. All of that process has to happen through a public comment submission, and the address is up on the screen. And for anyone who is interested, this presentation, as well as the information that you see and the report that I prepared for the county, is all available on the county's website. If you search Cape May County NJ Pact, that'll take you to the county's page, and you'll have all the information available to you. But moving on with the timeline, where we get to the end of the public comment period, and then DEP will go through a process of addressing your comments, responding to the questions that are raised, responding to the critique. And they will then be at a point where they can choose to adopt the rule as is or modify the rule based on resounding comments that they receive or clarifications that are necessary. But they have only until August of next summer, where they have to then file the notice of adoption. So this rule will have to be promulgated or be put in process for promulgation by next summer. So the time is limited, and now we must act. So what do these rules impact? Well, new development, as you might expect, but also redevelopment. And in the category of redevelopment, that also includes rehabilitation or renovation of existing structures. I'll get into that in a little bit more detail in just a few minutes, but to understand how this comes into effect, and you've heard reference to 51%. So any renovation that occurs to a structure that is in the regulated areas that I'll show in just a moment with mapping, any renovation that raises to the level of substantial improvement, where the cost of those improvements equals 50% of the market value of the structure. And I just want to repeat that, the market value of the structure, not the property, just the structure. So the costs that equal 50% or more of the market value of the structure then precipitate substantial improvement and forces that homeowner into a permitting process with DEP for a structure that's located in the inundation risk zone or a zone where there is a climate-adjusted flood elevation. So how did we get to this point? The state commissioned a scientific and technical advisory panel through Rutgers University in 2016. That panel then reconvened in 2019, and they arrived at the chart that you see up on the screen. And this essentially was a statistical analysis of information available at that time to create predicted sea level probabilities over a multi-year period. So at the top of the table, you'll see the years 2030 all the way up through 2150. And then on the side of the table, you'll see exceedance probabilities from a 95% chance to a 5% chance. There are two important numbers to remember as we go through the rules: the year 2100 and 5 feet. This scientific panel decided, the scientific panel prepared this table. DEP then decided to use year 2100 as their planning horizon for the regulations. But following in the column of the year 2100, assuming moderate greenhouse emissions, if you follow that brown column down, it intersects the 50% exceedance and the 17% exceedance probability to the left. So in the year 2100, this table and the panel indicates that there would be a 50% probability that sea level would exceed 3.3 feet of rise by the year 2100, and a 17% chance that sea level rise will exceed 5.1 feet in the year 2100. So why 2100? Why did DEP choose that as a horizon? Well, their thought was that any structures or infrastructure buildings that were constructed over the next few years and decades could conceivably still be in service by the year 2100. And they chose 5 feet to put into the rules because they looked to the more conservative approach of these probability exceedances. One of the things that I think is lost when considering the regulated and impacted public is how often we have a turnover in our housing stock. How often do we go through development cycles, especially in the coastal community, where 75 years is not a typical horizon for the redevelopment of a property. We may see 2 to 3 cycles of development in that 75-year time frame. So we're looking at a probability of exceedance 75 years in the future, but to be regulated starting sometime in the year 2025. That should get your attention. In over 1,000 pages of rules, you might imagine that there are a lot of changes. When I did this in Cape May City, I took them through each of the 1,000 pages, and 2 weeks later, we finally understood what the rules were all about. I'm going to spare you tonight. I'm going to focus on just 2 important concepts in the 1,000 pages. One is called the inundation risk zone, and the other is called the climate-adjusted flood elevation. The inundation risk zone, abbreviated IRZ, is the predicted area of permanent standing water due to sea level rise by the year 2100. So, assuming we have 5 feet of sea level rise by the year 2100, this is the land area that will be covered permanently by those waters. In addition to that, we have the climate-adjusted flood elevation, which is taking the existing FEMA 100-year flood elevations and adding 5 feet to that for a predicted limit of what a future flood would look like based on a 100-year flood in the year 2100. As you can see in the graphic, this has a compounding effect where 5 feet of sea level rise brings the shoreline further up, and then adding 5 feet to our existing flood elevations brings that structure further and further into risk. So I'll spend just a few minutes talking about the inundation risk zone. Again, this is the area that will be predicted to be permanently inundated by the year 2100. So as you see, we have a typical house along the shore, our current sea level, and where the ocean meets the land or the back bay waters meet the land, or for our mainland municipalities where our river systems like the Great Egg Harbor, the Tuckahoe, the Mullica, and some of the tidal creeks in Cape May County, where those move inland, and where that shoreline is, that's our current shoreline elevation. And when we add 5 feet to that, we can see that our shoreline moves significantly inland. Adding 5 feet in an area like Cape May County with very little topography moves horizontally quite a distance. 5 feet vertically translates into tens to hundreds of feet horizontally. So, new development, redevelopment including renovation at substantial improvement, if it meets that substantial improvement metric. For residential buildings and critical facilities and infrastructure, which is located in the IRZ zone, where the height, the footprint, or the habitable area will change as a result of that development or redevelopment or renovation, will be required to seek permits from DEP. Those permits will require an on-site impact assessment to determine what the impacts will be of developing on that property and to the impacts off-site that will result from developing that property. Additionally, an on-site alternatives analysis will be required. These are engineering analysis, as you might imagine, to consider what other alternatives are there. There's always a no-build scenario in an alternatives analysis. And then considering changing the design, changing the materials, changing the location of construction. On small lots, there isn't a whole lot that we have to change or to move. Lastly, and as was mentioned earlier, this permitting will also require or will include a condition as part of the permit, which will be a risk acknowledgement, meaning that a deed notice, in order to perfect the permit and conduct the activity, a deed notice will be required. That deed notice will include notification on the title. So in the chain of title, in perpetuity into the future, it will indicate that this property is located in an inundation zone, and it will list the anticipated amount of floodwater that will exist on the property in the future, but required to be filed in the present. As you might imagine, this has a disproportionate impact in Cape May County. 43% of the land mass of Cape May County ends up in the inundation risk zone. And in Ocean City, almost 82% ends up in the inundation risk zone. So when you consider properties where new development will occur, or redevelopment, or renovation to substantial improvement, consider whether you're in the inundation risk zone and what this will mean for you. The graphic on the board is Cape May County. For the ease of presentation, Cape May County is laid over on its side. So to the right is north. At the top of the graphic is the Delaware Bay, and the bottom is the Atlantic Ocean. And what you see in blue is the inundation risk zone. In Atlantic County, this covers 17%. But in Cape May County, as I said, we're at 43%. Zooming in, what you see is Ocean City in the lower left half of the graphic, with the exception of some streets in the Gardens and a couple other locations in town. 80% or 81% is included in the inundation risk zone. I think it was mentioned earlier also that our roadways are not flood compliant. And construction of the roadways and critical infrastructure will also be required to be brought into compliance and go through a permitting process. Many of our streets become the conduits for flooding, and that's represented here in the graphic as well. But this is not just isolated to Barrier Island communities, but we'll move south. We moved south and then west. As we move south into the Barrier Islands in the central portion of the county, Sea Isle City, Stone Harbor, Avalon, and look at the reach of that inundation risk zone all the way to the Garden State Parkway and even beyond in some locations, and to the southern tip of the peninsula with Cape May and Lower Township, but then even over to, this is a really finicky clicker, I guess. Okay. So if we look at the top of this graphic, this is not just a Barrier Island impact. Our low-lying municipalities and mainland areas along the Delaware Bay shore, where Pond Creek, Fishing Creek, Green Creek, Dias Creek, Dennis Creek, all of those communities are also impacted because those tidal zones come deep into the mainland area, and all of those residential communities that were developed long ago are impacted as well, and moving into the northern portion of the county. We'll now skip forward to the climate-adjusted flood elevation. So again, in contrast, inundation risk zone, those blue areas anticipated to be permanently inundated by floodwaters by the year 2100, predicted. The climate-adjusted flood elevation, I'll remind you, is taking the current FEMA 100-year flood zone and adding 5 feet to that. So in the graphic, we see current sea level, our 5 feet of sea level rise. We have structures, obviously, that are already built in the flood zone. This is Cape May County. We're close to the shoreline. We have flood zones. We have ordinances. We have building standards that tell us how to construct and build in the flood zone. But these rules add 5 feet. And they change our structures significantly. By DEP zone admission, these rules are intended to discourage further development of the Barrier Islands and our low-lying mainland areas. And this just doesn't impact residential and critical facilities as the inundation risk zone does. This is for all habitable structures. So any habitable areas, commercial, residential, industrial, institutional uses, all will have to comply. Any habitable space will have to comply with finished floor elevations that meet these standards if new development, redevelopment, rehabilitation to substantial improvement are proposed, where permitting will require those finished floor elevations to be 1 foot above the current FEMA elevation. This brings over 60% of Cape May County into the flood zone. It brings 30% of Atlantic County into the flood zone. And some might have you believe that this is just limited to the Barrier Islands, to the coastal portion of the state. But we did an analysis and we determined that major cities in New Jersey like Hoboken, Jersey City, Newark, Elizabeth, Long Branch, Asbury Park, Camden, and Salem City all are impacted by the climate-adjusted flood elevation. In some cases, municipalities, Hoboken, 89% covered by flood hazard. Salem City, 78.5% included by flood hazard areas. Let's see what this looks like. Again, same orientation, the Delaware Bay at the top, Atlantic Ocean at the bottom. What you see in orange are the existing flood zones. What you see in red are areas that are now going to be regulated as flood zones by DEP for permitting purposes. What this graphic doesn't tell you, or doesn't really depict well, is that those areas in orange that are currently in flood zones, many of those structures may have been renovated after Superstorm Sandy and brought into compliance. But any changes to habitable area, height, dwelling units will prompt a permitting action and will now will require those currently compliant structures to meet these new standards and re-raise the finished floor elevation to 1 foot above base flood. In Ocean City, I think you have flood elevation zones. Your AE zones are elevations 8 through 11. This will change that to new flood elevations of 13 to 16 feet. It should also be mentioned, and I'll just click through, you'll see the coverage down along the coast from Ocean City moving south to Sea Isle, to Avalon and Stone Harbor, the Wildwoods, Cape May. And it's important to note those blue areas were much less restrictive than these. You can see how far, let me just skip back here. Consider our major evacuation routes in the county. These flood zones reach well past the Garden State Parkway, well into the Route 9 corridor. And as we move to the western half of Cape May County, consider Route 47 and how far this reaches into those evacuation routes. Should also be noted that, I'll leave that up, that FEMA right now is in the process of a New Jersey coastal restudy. And this is where they're taking their existing flood mapping, the FEMA mapping, the flood insurance rate maps that you may be familiar with, where those AE8 to AE11 zones come from for Ocean City. And then they're in the process of reevaluating those maps using new data post Superstorm Sandy to look at how those maps should be adjusted to deal with sea level rise. They've completed their initial portion of that analysis, which is called a still water analysis, and that's to look at what static elevation in a flood event would be, barring any kind of wave action. So the static elevation raises the current flood zones from 1/2 foot on the Back Bay areas to 1.5 feet on the Atlantic Ocean side and the Delaware Bay side. So consider, that's the initial review by FEMA. They have yet to engage, or are just on the cusp of engaging their wave modeling, which introduces dynamic flooding into those metrics, and that will further compound what the future flood maps that FEMA will produce and the elevations that will be reflected on them. So you may recall earlier I said the climate-adjusted flood elevation is adding 5 feet to the prevailing FEMA maps. Today, that's 8 to 11 feet. A year from now, that could be 1 to 2 feet higher, and then adding 5 feet to that. We could see 6 to 8 feet of elevation of required flood adjustment that results from these rules. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with you and your ability to scan these codes and ring in and let your voices be heard. This is not limited to Ocean City. This is a statewide consideration. It's a concern. Cape May County has been the leading voice in educating the public about these rules. The rest of the state is now waking up. Other counties are starting to understand. Atlantic County has passed a resolution. There are other counties that are passing resolutions of concern. And essentially, it's a recognition that we have a need for comprehensive and incremental strategies to adjust and adapt to sea level rise. No one here is denying climate change. No one here is denying that we need to adapt and we need to have design standards that adjust to sea level rise. What the state tends to forget is that many of the municipalities in Cape May County have been doing this on their own for years as part of the CRS program, where they've adopted more conservative standards, 1 to 2 feet of additional freeboard beyond what the FEMA maps and the National Flood Insurance Program requires. So our municipalities, our local units of government, they've been working on this for years, recognizing that we live in an exposed area of the coast and that we have to adapt. We have to take the responsibility to make changes. We were doing that long before the state decided to pass regulations to tell us when to do it and how to do it. But these regulations tell us to do it overnight and to a predicted condition 75 years into the future. This rule proposal is drastic. As I said, it creates immediate change. It has happened without the necessary stakeholder engagement, contacting our tourism industries, our commercial fishing industries. It's happened without legislative input. It's happened without the voice of the folks that you have elected to represent you in Trenton. It's happened without a comprehensive economic impact analysis. DEP is required to do an impact analysis as part of its rules. They did. They focused on what are the impacts to communities after a severe or a significant coastal storm event has occurred. They didn't look at the impacts on the front side, which is once these rules are put into effect and we have immediate drastic changes to these elevations, what happens to our ratables? What happens to our tax base? What happens to our zoning standards? what happens to you as a homeowner who is embarking on a renovation project, and you march into the construction office and you're greeted by the floodplain manager and the construction official who have to work from ordinances that DEP has provided to them that dictate what substantial improvement consists of, and how you then have an additional step in your renovation process, which involves the state and a discretionary evaluation of impacts and alternatives and the cost of that permitting and the time that it takes to go through permitting. This has also happened without the benefit of FEMA's mapping. That is in process right now. It should have and acknowledge what the FEMA studies represent and include that as we move forward and adapt these new policies over time. So in conclusion, it makes sense that we pause the process. We adjust to a more reasonable planning horizon, not 75 years into the future, but something that's more akin to what we see for municipal and county master plans. A 10-year planning horizon or a 20-year planning horizon where we can compare real-world situations to a predicted condition and then go through an iterative process to adapt over time and develop a plan that can be implemented not to deny climate change, but to adapt and to give you and the industries that we rely on to be able to live and work in the coastal zone the ability to stay here and to thrive into the future. Thank you, and I'll hang around for questions afterwards.
Peter, thank you so much. Questions? There are a couple of mics here. Anybody have questions? Come up and join us with questions. Sir.
Peter, thanks so much for coming tonight. The last 75 years ago, we had no climate restrictions, laws, anything. And yet, as someone who grew up on the Bay in Avalon and have lived there, basically for the last, 70 years with my family, we've seen almost no elevation change really in the water. A little bit maybe, but nothing meaningful that's changed anything. Why are we saying that the next 75 years is going to be so radically different than the last 75 years when we know that that hasn't happened at a period in time which we didn't have any rules or regulations hardly? Why did they suddenly believe the next 75 years are magically going to be so different than the last 75 years?
I wish I had a great answer for you. Again, not a climate scientist. This information comes out of Rutgers Scientific Technical and Advisory Panel. There is measurable sea level rise. We've seen that. And we've seen that occurring over the last decade or so, actually more than that, about 2 decades. In Kidman County, we have kind of a unique situation in coastal New Jersey. We have sea level rise. That's a combination of actual sea level increasing, but also the geological plate that we sit on sinking. And I think you mentioned you're on the back bay of Avalon, where we also have our coastal marsh areas that are losing sediment. So we're losing land mass and land elevation in the back bay waters, where we do have these perceptible increases in sea level elevation. So it's a compounding effect. Why it's accelerating or why it's predicted in acceleration, I don't have the background for that information, but there is an inherent logarithmic curve to the prediction where it's expected to accelerate, or based on this technical advisory document, they're anticipating for it to accelerate, and so that's how they get to those substantial numbers relatively quickly, where when we look backwards, we don't see that kind of substantial change.
Yes, sir.
Hello. I had a question concerning Table 1 of the plan that is the basis of most of this, the sea level rise. Did the technical committee actually release the data which was the basis for that table? And I ask this because I think it's probably based on what appears to be much more data than it actually is, since the tide only repeats once in 19 years. So they're only looking at 5 data points. Did they actually release the data and the datum?
So the report is available. I don't know about the background data that they used for
The one
that.
the one that I read only talked about the impacts and showed that table.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's an appendix to that report, but if you're interested, I don't know. Did you go to the 2019 report?
Yes.
Okay.
No
All right.
data.
So that's an update from 2016, and if it doesn't include any of the additional
No
data,
data.
then I suppose they're reserving that for themselves.
Mr. Lomax, Aiden F. Noonan, 1722 Simpson Avenue. Will our elevation certificates be worth anything after this Executive Order 100 is implemented as an administrative code? And then 2, our flood insurance rates, will they still be based on federal law, or will they be based on both federal law and state law?
Two great questions. And DEP is quick to point out that these are regulations that that don't by themselves create increased insurance costs. That's a little bit of a difficult web to weave. Flood elevation certificates will continue to be just as they are. However, in the event that you're required to get a DEP permit, you will then have to meet the new standard. So if you have a flood elevation certificate for your current structure, but you're planning to change that, that flood elevation certificate will in no way provide you relief from having to meet the new regulatory standards. Okay. The second part of your question is almost impossible to answer. How does this impact the insurance industry, and will it be based on federal standards or not? I think, as you know, there is a private sector for flood insurance, and then the federal. The flood insurance industry seems to be moving away from just predicating policy premiums on the FEMA mapping, the firm mapping, where they're now going into their own algorithms, I guess is the best way to put it. And no one's entirely sure what the input information is, where they arrive at their premium costs. It can and could include the flood insurance rate maps and the new flood maps, but it could also include some of these other considerations, including these regulations. We just don't know, and I don't think the insurance industry yet has put anything out there that helps us understand exactly what they're going to use to calculate new premiums. But for properties where you have financing institutions that are lending on that structure, there's certainly the question as to whether they would require some additional insurance or considerations based on the DEP proposed map. It's just too soon to tell at this point.
Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Hi. I was wondering if you could explain to me the point of reference for base flood elevation. When I bought my home in 1978 here, I was given a certificate. I was 12 and a half feet above mean high tide. Well, with FEMA changing all of that, what is the new reference now for your base flood elevation? What is it called?
Yeah, so my guess is based on the timing that you're talking about, your flood certificate was probably in the NGVD 29 datum, and now they're using the NAVD 88 datum, and there's a conversion factor, so if you go online, you can enter So if you were to Google conversion NGVD 29 to NAVD 88, you can enter your geographic location and the two different datums, and it can give you a conversion factor. So it will tell you what your 12-foot of elevation is presently in the new datum.
Okay. And you had also mentioned that, I think your words were improvements or renovations that exceed 50% of the market value of the structure. Is that the appraised value of the structure? Because nobody knows what the market value of any structure is on this island from day to day. It will keep changing. And what do you do about a 1940 house that's well maintained, but whose detached garage and main house roofs will be approaching end of life on a structure that's appraised at $60,000? Just maintaining your home could easily put you in that dangerous area of having to raise your home.
Yeah, so for the first part of your question, it is the market value of the structure. I think the municipality has some flexibility in terms of how they determine the market value of the structure. DEP is not going to be the one to do that. That gets passed on to you and the benefit to the municipality to try to figure out and dissect that requirement. It can include an appraisal to determine and define exactly what the market rate of the structure is. But I think the municipality has some other ways of determining what they believe the market value to be, and then you would back into your 50%, your metric towards substantial improvement from there.
Okay, so you would have to get a market value appraisal currently, and it is not the appraised value as per my tax.
It's not the assessed value. I think you're referring to the assessed
value.
Yeah, it is not the assessed value. It is specifically the market value of the structure.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm a realtor here in Ocean City. My question is, at what point does this need to be disclosed to future sellers and buyers? Is that when the governor signs it or when it's enacted in 2025? And have there been any impact studies on the real estate industry here in Cape May County or the tourism industry, what this new legislation will do to the real estate industry here? And when does it need to be disclosed to people that are buying and selling this happening? Because it's really going to be impactful.
No economic impact studies to affected industries that I am aware of. I think that's one of the glaring holes in this process. But in terms of when does disclosure occur, it's my understanding New Jersey is a buyer beware state. So there are folks that will need to ask those questions and be informed in the process. But at a minimum, aside from the regulation, there will be deed notices attached to the chain of title for any property that has gone through a permitting exercise. So something as simple as constructing a new structure or renovating a structure in one of these areas that goes through a permitting process, that permit will be issued with a condition that requires that a deed notice be filed with the county clerk's office that establishes not just, and this is not a new concept. Current DEP regulations specify, so for instance, if you get a wetlands determination on a piece of property, a letter of interpretation, there's a condition that requires a deed notice, which states that there are wetlands on the property. It puts a future property owner in an educated position of understanding that they're about to purchase a property, as long as they go through, title work, that they're about to purchase a piece of property that has wetlands on it. Similarly, projects that get a current flood hazard permit or a CAF or a coastal permit where flooding based on the current FEMA maps is anticipated to result during a 500-year storm. There is a deed notice that is filed based on that condition that notifies a future property owner through this deed notice in their title work that flooding inundation will be 2 feet, 5 feet, whatever it is on that property during a 100-year flood event. These regulations are different. This is a deed notice that talks about saying that the property will be inundated based on a future condition that is predicted, not on a current condition. Wetlands are on the property. That's been verified, right? That's a simple deed notice, and it's easy for someone to understand that. Someone who now has to file a deed notice and essentially mark their property as one that will be partially or fully underwater based on a predicted condition 75 years into the future, that's a significant departure from what's currently required. Yes, sir.
Two quick questions. First of all, the DEP permitting process today is pretty arduous. It's expensive. They're under-resourced, understaffed. Was there any consideration at all from the state on the tens of thousands of potential applications they would have to process through the government, and any talks on like timing? I mean, they can't, I mean, it can get log jammed now immensely. Has there been any consideration on the cost of government to just process these permits and handle all of this work? That's one question.
Given that permitting is something I do for a living, I appreciate that question.
Yes. That's one question, then answer this and I'll have one more.
And I asked that question, and I was told that the state, the DEP, will evaluate its staffing resources, ensure that adequate staffing will be allocated when and where needed. For someone who puts DEP applications together every day, when I left the office, I was editing an application that will be submitted tomorrow. And for those who have gone through the permitting process, it is lengthy, as you said, arduous. It's complicated to navigate. But once the permit application arrives at DEP, well, then their staff has to go through page by page and go through an analysis and verify whether the information submitted is accurate and whether it's complete and whether it meets the design standards. And that in and of itself is a tedious process, and I feel for the folks who are in the trenches having to do that work. Right now, we're seeing flood hazard applications going to the 90th day, where they are then forced, because of their work volumes, having to ask for 30-day extensions to be able to continue that process further. We've experienced situations where, because of these mandatory review timelines, applications have had to be withdrawn and resubmitted because the application couldn't be reviewed in time for action to be taken before the statutory decision deadline. So it is a valid concern, one that I asked the question to, and I got a very boilerplate answer.
Got it. Thank you. Part two, more specific to Ocean City and the challenges of very small lots. Was there any consideration in the 1,000+ pages on communities very much like Ocean City with 25, 30, 50-foot lots, bulk requirements that are taking up a large percentage of that land, where in low-lying areas like even in AE 11, where you may have a street elevation at say 6, you're talking a structure that could be 16 feet higher than the actual street elevation, almost a two full stories. When you don't, with the bulk requirements don't even give you, you'd have to scissor back stairs, probably multiple flights, just to get into the first floor within the exterior envelope of the building. And my question is do these regulations take into consideration the architectural impacts and the bulk requirements in communities with small lots and how that will actually work?
In short, they do not, and there is not a relief provision for that. But I take your example of this double switchback staircase. Now translate that into an ADA compatible ramp, which has to be
1 to 12.
1 to 12, 3 feet wide with railings 4 feet wide. Imagine how many switchbacks we're talking about to get 10 feet in elevation. We don't have front yards or side yard bulk requirements that would allow for that. I think you'd probably start in the center line of the street and have to work your way in from there, which goes back to the assemblyman's point. about elevators and then the need to retrofit facilities with elevators and then how that translates into the costs as well. So I wish I could tell you, but I wish I could tell you that thought had been given to that. Maybe thought has been given to that. I did not see it reflected in the rules, and certainly that's just one more disconnect I think that there is, no different than not considering our commercial fishing industry and how they load and offload and process their catch. We're adding 5 feet to the finished floor elevation of their processing facility, can make it impossible to have the head pressure that they need to pull the material out of the holds of the ship to be able to offload. That's a $300 million industry in Cape May County alone.
Thank you for all the information.
Good evening. We talked about executive orders that were issued by Governor Murphy. My question is, the President in Washington, most of the bills get passed are executive orders. And the first day the next party gets in office, they revoke all the executive orders. Now, I know New Jersey, and it's either Virginia or West Virginia, the two governors have the most power when it comes to executive orders in the country. My simple question is, Murphy's out of office in November. I think you said this bill has to go into effect by August 31st. I was in the back and I don't hear that good. Can the new governor come in, reverse this, and make it go back to normal?
Assemblyman?
And it goes away. All you got to do is get the right guy in office.
Assemblyman, I think we finally have a question for you.
There definitely is that possibility, but you got to make sure you vote the right person in. So elections have consequences, and anybody that comes down here and seeking our vote needs to understand we don't want this, and they're not going to get our support if they're supporting this.
Hi, my question is in reference to the deed notice and the raising or elevating a house. If the deed is touched, not a permit for building, but if the deed is just, I think the term is a revocation of deed, does that action cause the house to comply to the latest requirements? For instance, I had a condo, top and bottom, and I owned the entire house now, so I had a revocation of deed to make it a duplex. If I were to sell half and remove that revocation to go back to a condo, does that require an update to the latest code?
I don't know if the simple act of, I don't know the answer.
Okay.
Logically thinking, I think a permitting, what I understand from the rule, having been through it, discussed it with DEP, a permitting action has to result in order for you to end up with a deed notice and having to go through a retrofitting of the facility. But you bring up another good point, and it's one that I discussed with the engineer in Cape May City, and that is that for, as you mentioned, a condo. So you could have a structure that's a condo unit, and one of the condo unit holders goes through a process of renovating their unit. And then the second condo unit holder says, oh, geez, I think I'll go through a renovation process as well. Well, for these structures, it's my understanding from the construction official that as you go through this process, there's a look-back period, so they can track costs over time to see whether you meet that substantial improvement metric. And those costs are aggregated based on the units of that structure. So each individual doesn't necessarily have 50% of the structure. They have to divide that amongst themselves.
Okay. I have one other question about the flood insurance. How is that going to be mandated, and how is it going to be enforced? Like, for instance, if you don't have flood insurance or don't want it?
Good question. So my understanding is that if you are in a flood zone and the structure is financed, that the lending institution is the one that requires that.
Right.
If you're not in a situation where you're required to have flood insurance and you opt not to, I don't think these rules necessarily change that.
Okay. Well, that's it. Thank you.
Yes, first I'd like to thank you all for this presentation. It's very helpful for me especially. I think I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. It's more of a personal question. My wife and I have been meeting with architects and builders about demolishing and building a new home starting next September. And if
You're asking me for the over-under, aren't you?
yeah. So if this executive order becomes law in August, and it seems to me that we're going to be at risk that permitting and everything else involved will go in. We could potentially be affected by that at this juncture, anyway, from what I understand.
We haven't seen anything definitively that the state is backing off of this matter. I think that will become relatively clear in the next couple months. But to this point, all the indication is that they're going to continue to move forward with this, but all the more reason that they hear from all of us.
Okay, thank you.
First and foremost, thank you so much for the presentation. It's very enlightening. I came here to learn. I didn't get to see your presentation earlier, and I want everyone to know what a pleasure it is to serve in the legislature with Ocean City's favorite son, Antoine McClellan. But the one thing that I'm being told in Trenton, and I know it's being told by opponents of NJ Pact, REAL, Executive Order 100, is that the entire study was based on a debunked study from Rutgers. My understanding is that that study by Rutgers has been debunked and is based on a very, very low percentage scenario in the first place. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so I think that the term of art is low confidence. So the statistical analysis that is inherent in this study concluded that there was low confidence in some of the sea level predictions. And that has been explained by DEP as low confidence as a term of art in statistics, meaning that there was inadequate data to support a finding that could be corroborated by multiple sources. So I think what we have is a study coming out of this Rutgers panel in 16 and 19, which, again, because it's specific to New Jersey's coastal zone, is not corroborated by a number of other peer-reviewed scientific publications. That then means we're relying on a single source of data to make these predictions, and then taking the extraordinary step of developing regulations based on something where there is uncorroborated information.
So you're speaking in very technical terms. In the legislature, we don't hear that very often and people's eyes glaze over. But what we were told is that this is essentially, we're making broad sweeping regulations which excluded the legislature entirely on a doomsday prediction. Would you agree with that?
So these are drastic changes. Since I'm not a trained climate scientist, I can't tell you whether these are doomsday predictions. But what I can tell you is that regardless of what's going to happen in the year 2100, we need to be adapting and making plans for what happens in the next 20 years or 25 years that can be corroborated by real-term, real-life events. And then we can look at the next 20 to 25 years and decide what do we need to do to plan for that.
Thank you, because what it seems to me is that the DEP sees us, human beings, as the invasive species, and they want us, human beings, to retreat from our coastal areas and our bayshore communities like we have in Cumberland County, as the Assemblyman elucidated earlier. And it's just really unfair to homeowners and people who want to purchase a home at the shore as their dream home. And I really appreciate the thought that went into this presentation, because it truly shows that they are making such broad, sweeping, drastic changes to regulations by way of executive fiat without including Antoine, Eric, myself, and all of the other legislators in the state of New Jersey that are affecting not only just places like Ocean City, Wildwood, Avalon, places in Cape May County, but places in Cumberland County like Down Township, and also places like you said, Hoboken, Elizabeth, Jersey City. This is affecting a very large portion of the state, in a state that's already really not very affordable or easy to live and maintain a home in. So just thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
And thank you. And Senator, I think about the working waterfronts along the Morris River and the legacy of shipbuilding that has occurred there, and the communities, Dorchester and Leesburg and Bivalve and some of those other communities that are along the Delaware Bay and in that estuary that for years have relied on and depended on, made their living based on working the sea, working the bay. They understand the maritime community, and these municipalities, again, they're going through the process of adapting. They're studying it, they're making changes, they're adapting their infrastructure, and they're making these changes, and they did so long before these rules came about, and I trust that they'll continue to do it regardless of these rules.
Thank you for all your hard work. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I had a couple questions, just one of clarification. Were you saying that there was no other stakeholders with input in these rules being developed other than the DEP?
No, I would say that there was biased stakeholder input.
Okay.
Commercial fishing industry did not have a seat at the table. The tourism industry did not have a seat at the table. I think I went, it's been a while now, but I looked at the public meetings that were held, and I think for municipal input, there was one meeting in 2021, likely virtual. If I think back to what was happening in our world in 2021, I suppose it was probably a virtual meeting. There have been various stakeholder sessions and presentations by DEP over the last year or so. There was one to the Cape May County Chamber of Commerce. In fact, I think the Assemblyman and Senator were there for that presentation, and there was one person from DEP who was there to present, but the full slate of officials from DEP did not come. But there has been stakeholder input, but I would say it's largely been on the supporting side of the regulation as opposed to the concerns, the economic impacts, and the industries and government industry that's also being affected.
Thank you. And so is this adding 1,000 pages to already existing rules and regulations, or how many pages of rules are we dealing with, or do you deal with when you're submitting an application and now have to deal with these 1,000 pages?
So at my last count, I think the existing coastal zone management rules were 700 and some pages. So this adds to that.
Okay.
Yeah, it eclipses the 700 pages. Yeah.
Quite a bit. And from a permitting standpoint, so the gentleman that mentioned he's in the process of looking at rebuilding next year, will a homeowner now have to apply to the DEP in addition to the local municipality?
If they hit that, so for a renovation project,
Or a
if they
new
hit that
construction.
substantial improvement metric, then yes, that will trigger a permitting event with DEP. So in addition to construction permits here locally, they really would need to start first. I suspect what will happen is folks who are unaware will come into the construction office having worked with their design professional who, if they're not familiar with the rules, will design a home on a lot, and then that'll proceed to the point where they are ready to pull construction permits, only to realize that they've surpassed this substantial improvement metric and need to pause and go back and seek land use permitting from DEP.
And that's just if it's a renovation. If it's a new construction,
If it's a new construction, then that,
definitely.
well, depending on where it
Where
occurs,
of
but
course.
I saw a lot of blue on that map.
In the county, yes. So I'm an insurance agent in town. From the cost of increased cost for insurance, the likelihood is we're already dealing with a pretty tough insurance marketplace in the state, as everyone I'm sure is aware. but the increased cost of construction is now going to increase the cost of your insurance costs, and it's going to make it really a more, or an already unfriendly environment for businesses. It's going to make it even less attractive for new insurance companies that are looking to enter the state to come in and do business here. So
Yeah, I wish I had handed the mic off to you when those insurance questions came in earlier, but
I'll stick around if anyone has questions later.
there you go.
Thank you, Peter.
All right, last call, one more. Yes, sir.
How are you today? Thank you for having the meeting. I appreciate it. I guess refresh my memory if I didn't catch it off of your presentation. When was the Rutgers report done?
The panel was first convened in 2016, and they, excuse me, and then again in 2019.
Okay.
So we're dealing with data that's approximately 5 years old now.
Okay. So that was my first question. I have a comment, and then I have a second question, maybe for the Assemblyman or somebody, anybody up there. My comment is then, to me, this is an agenda. This is not about, they're not worrying about climate change, not worrying about the major storm coming in 2100, not. Look in our country as it is now, Palestine, Ohio, train wreck in water. They still haven't fixed that. All the contaminations. They're taking people's lands, they're taking people's houses. They're paying pennies on the dollar for that. This is going on in Asheville, North Carolina, where you hear all of a sudden, we found lithium. So guess what? We're going to create some kind of havoc going on. We're not going to allow you to build back on us. We're taking eminent domain. We're taking the property. And this is government, big government control. That's my opinion. These executive orders, and you said 2019 was Rutgers, correct?
Yes.
Okay. These executive orders, Executive Order 7, 8, 9, 89, 28, 100, the state enacted the Global Warming Response Act in July of 2007. So they've been step by step working their way toward this. I guess there's really no question for you that, but that's my opinion again. We're being overrun by big government, and it's not just here, it's throughout the country. I guess the other question is for the wind turbines, since Murphy is Mr. Wind Turbine, and he says we're going to put wind turbines in, I don't care what you say. Is he going to adhere to these measures? Raise wind turbines in the ocean 5 feet, 10 feet, 15 feet? Is he going to stand to that? Thank you.
So interestingly enough about the wind turbines, there is consideration in those 1,000 plus pages to help out wind turbines if they're going to be built. So just think about that.
All right, last call. Before we close it up, a couple more comments before I conclude the evening. Assemblyman.
Just in finishing, thanking everybody for coming out, and just know that Senator Testa, Assemblyman Simonson, and myself have been reaching out to everybody along with the county. Congressman Van Drew, who could not make it tonight, has reached out to the governor and has reached out to the DEP commissioner and is fighting on the federal level as well. And he knows that the FEMA maps are coming out, so we got all horses in the stable and ready to fight. And working with Atlantic County, Cumberland County, Salem County, Ocean County, and Monmouth County is just the tip of the iceberg. So we're going to continue to fight on your behalf, but we're requesting your help. So please make sure you respond to anybody and everybody that are friends, family, people that rent, people that own, that don't live in this state, need to know what's going on. And they need to respond to the governor and to the DEP so they understand that we're not standing for this. So thank you for coming out and continue to fight. And you can reach out to our office, the congressman's office, or the county's office for any questions or concerns that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we're gonna wrap it up here. Be respectful of everybody's time. I would just like to first thank Peter for the work that you do and for the time, for being very generous with your time and to make the presentation tonight. I think it's very important. I want to thank the state legislative delegation, Senator Testa, Antoine. Thank you for being here. The other county elected officials that are here as well. I am not going to wade into who the favorite mayor is, so I'll just say it's 1 and 1A, and I won't tell you which one is either. But in all seriousness, I want to thank you. Let me conclude by saying a couple of things about focus. First, we want to thank the city, the county, and the state delegation for hosting this. For those of you who got checked in, I want to thank the volunteers that were here tonight, trying to make this a smooth process. We look forward to doing more of those, but in order to do that, we need two things. We need your involvement. If you would like to have other events like this on other topics, I would love to let you know. And then finally, I am not going to be shy about this. Organizations like this run on your involvement, your engagement, and also your ability to donate and keep things going. So if you're interested in doing that, we're more than happy to have you. And let me just close by saying the overarching message that I think we heard here tonight, whether it applies to this topic, whether it applies to windmills or 1,000 other things, is that the unchecked administrative power of the regulatory state is dangerous and a threat. We hear so much today about threats to democracy, but when this type of sweeping regulation can be imposed without consultation of our elected representation and our elected representatives, there is an issue that needs to be corrected, and we all need to be vigilant about that. With that, I want to thank you very much for coming out. Appreciate it, and enjoy your evening. Happy Halloween and happy holidays, everybody.